June 7, 1944. The cliffs at Longues-sur-Mer on the coast of Normandy. Inside a concrete observation bunker that still stands today, German gunners look out across the water, between the landing beaches the Allies have named Gold and Omaha. The English Channel has changed overnight. The day before, it was empty grey sea. This morning, it is crowded with iron. Since before dawn, the German defenders along this coast have watched destroyers and cruisers shelling the shoreline. They have watched landing craft crawl toward the sand in waves. But the strangest sight is not the warships at all. It is what is happening behind them, farther out, in open water where no harbour has ever existed. Enormous things are being moved into position. Slabs of grey concrete, the size of apartment blocks, are being towed by tugs, and then, deliberately, sunk. Old rusting merchant ships are steaming into a line and dropping beneath the surface on purpose. Steel structures with legs are being lowered onto the seabed. Long jointed roadways are being unrolled across the swell like ribbon. By every rule of war the German army was taught, this should not be possible. An invading force needs a port. You cannot land 1 million men and their tanks and their fuel and their food onto bare sand and keep them supplied for weeks. The sea will not allow it. The tides will not allow it. The first serious storm will smash everything on the beach to splinters. To sustain an invasion, you must capture a working harbour with deep water and stone quays and cranes, and you must do it quickly, or your army starves where it stands. The German High Command believed this so completely that they had built their entire defensive strategy around it. And along this stretch of Normandy, the enemy was ignoring the rule entirely. The Allies were not racing inland to seize a port. They were not even looking for one. They were calmly assembling a harbour of their own, out of the sea, on a coast that had none. Within days, the puzzle on the water would travel up the whole German chain of command, from coastal gunners to field marshals to the Reich Chancellery itself. How do you invade without a port? It is a question the most experienced soldiers in Europe struggled to answer. The German generals were not fools. They were the inheritors of the finest military staff tradition on the continent. They had conquered Poland, France, and most of European Russia. And yet, faced with the coast of Normandy in the summer of 1944, they were left staring at the water, unable to explain how their enemy was being fed, armed, and reinforced through a harbour that had not existed the week before. To understand their confusion, we cannot begin on D-Day. We have to go back almost 2 years earlier, to a different French port, and to one of the bloodiest mornings the British and Canadian armies would ever endure, because the answer the Germans could not explain in 1944 had been written in blood on a beach in 1942. That beach was Dieppe. On August 19, 1942, an Allied force of just over 6,000 men, the great majority of them Canadians, with British commandos and a handful of American Rangers, threw themselves against the fortified French port of Dieppe. The plan was to seize a working harbour, hold it briefly, and prove that a defended port could be taken by direct assault. What followed was a massacre. The tanks bogged down on the shingle. The men were cut down at the waterline. Of the nearly 5,000 Canadians who set out, fewer than half came back to England. More than 1,900 were taken prisoner. Around 900 Canadians died. German losses were a fraction of that. In a single morning, the Allies learned a lesson they would never forget. You cannot storm a fortified port. The defenders will wreck it before they lose it, and they will slaughter you while you try. If the Allies were ever going to return to Europe in force, they would need another way to land their supplies. And as the survivors of Dieppe sailed home in shock, the naval commander of the raid, Vice Admiral John Hughes Hallett, said something that sounded, at the time, completely absurd. If they could not capture a port, then they would have to take one with them. People laughed. You cannot carry a harbour across the sea. And yet the idea was not new. It had been quietly waiting in the mind of one man for more than 20 years. That man was Winston Churchill. Back in 1917, during the First World War, as Minister of Munitions, Churchill had sketched out a scheme for artificial harbours made of sunken caissons, to be used in landings on the German coast. The war ended before anything came of it, and the idea was shelved. But Churchill never truly let it go. He had also helped plan the disastrous landings at Gallipoli in 1915, where a stalled amphibious assault had been pinned against the shore and bled white. He understood, better than almost anyone alive, what happened to an army that could not be supplied across a beach. So 3 months before Dieppe, on May 30, 1942, Churchill sent a memo to Lord Louis Mountbatten, the Chief of Combined Operations. The subject was piers for use on beaches. The wording has become famous. The piers, he wrote, must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. Let me have the best solution worked out. Do not argue the matter. The difficulties will argue for themselves. It was an order to solve the impossible and a refusal to hear excuses. And remarkably, a small group of engineers and scientists set out to do exactly that. The first was a Welsh civil engineer named Hugh Iris Hughes, who had once worked on the building of Wembley Stadium. He drew up the earliest complete design and tested his concrete units on the sands of North Wales. The second was a Royal Engineers officer, Major Alan Beckett, who designed a flexible floating roadway that could ride the waves instead of breaking against them, along with a brilliant anchor, the kite, that buried itself deeper the harder it was pulled. The third was a Cambridge physicist named John Desmond Burnell, who studied the behaviour of waves and breakwaters, and once demonstrated the principle to Churchill using paper boats and a loofah in the Prime Minister's bathtub. Out of these efforts came one of the most audacious engineering projects in the history of warfare. Its code name was Mulberry. The plan was to build 2 complete artificial harbours in Britain, in total secrecy, then tow them piece by piece across the Channel and assemble them off the Normandy beaches. Each harbour was to be roughly the size of the great port of Dover, which in peacetime had taken more than 7 years to build. The Allies intended to build theirs in a matter of days, under fire. The scale was staggering. The project drew in around 45,000 workers across some 300 engineering firms throughout Britain. They poured around 600,000 tons of concrete. They built 146 of the giant caissons called Phoenix units, the largest of them over 6,000 tons each. They prepared around 10 miles of floating roadway. The harbours had a whole secret vocabulary. The sunken concrete caissons were phoenixes. The lines of old ships scuttled to make calm water were gooseberries. The floating outer breakwaters were bombardons. The flexible roadways were whales. And the pierheads that rose and fell with the tide on long legs planted in the seabed were called spuds. To hide all this from German reconnaissance, the caissons were partly sunk in anchorages along the English coast, then pumped out and refloated just before the invasion. German aircraft did photograph some of the structures, but their interpreters could not make sense of them. They guessed the units might be floating piers or fuel containers, or perhaps block ships meant to be sunk in their own harbours. The propaganda broadcaster known as Lord Haw Haw even taunted the British, saying the Germans would happily sink the strange concrete boxes for them and save them the trouble. The enemy had seen the pieces of the puzzle. They simply could not imagine the picture they formed. This was the great irony at the heart of the whole story. For 2 years, Nazi Germany had poured its strength into the Atlantic Wall, a vast belt of coastal fortifications. Adolf Hitler had formally declared the major ports to be fortresses, to be defended to the last man and destroyed rather than surrendered. Cherbourg, Le Havre, Boulogne, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, all of them turned into strongholds. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt both expected the blow to fall where the channel was narrowest, near the Pas de Calais, close to a great port. An elaborate Allied deception encouraged exactly that belief, and so the powerful German 15th Army waited for an attack near Calais that never came, while the real invasion landed in Normandy. Germany had spent its concrete locking every door it thought the enemy might use, and the Allies had simply walked in through a wall by bringing their own door with them. From the afternoon of D-Day, the towing began. More than 400 separate units, around 1.5 million tons of equipment, set out across the channel. The first great caisson was sunk off the village of Arromanches at dawn on June 8. Within roughly 12 days, 2 working harbours stood off the coast of France. One, Mulberry A, served the Americans off Omaha Beach. The other, Mulberry B, served the British and Canadians off Arromanches, and it earned a new name. The men called it Port Winston. Then nature did what the German army could not. On June 19, 1944, the worst Channel storm in 40 years struck the Normandy coast and raged for 3 days. The American harbour at Omaha was torn apart, most of its caissons wrecked beyond saving, and the Americans abandoned it. They went back to landing their supplies straight over the open sand, and to everyone's surprise, kept their armies moving. The British harbour at Arromanches, better sheltered and more strongly anchored, was battered but survived. It was repaired with salvage from the ruined American port and kept working. General Omar Bradley admitted that in 4 days this storm had threatened the invasion with greater danger than all the enemy's guns in 14 days ashore, and still the Mulberry held. Then, at last, the Allies captured a real port. The city of Cherbourg fell at the end of June. And when they entered the harbour, they understood at last what Dieppe had warned them about. The Germans had demolished it with surgical thoroughness. They had sunk block ships, blown the cranes into the water, cratered the quays, and sown the seabed with mines. The American engineer who wrote the plan to rebuild it called it the most complete and best-planned demolition in history. It would be weeks before large ships could use Cherbourg, and months before it ran at full capacity. The artificial harbour at Arromanches, meanwhile, was already working, and would keep working for around 10 months. This was the final vindication. The port the Germans were so sure the Allies needed turned out to be a wreck when it was finally taken. The harbour the Allies built themselves carried the war. Over those months, Port Winston landed more than 2.5 million men, around 500,000 vehicles, and roughly 4 million tons of supplies onto a coast that, on the 5th of June, had possessed no harbour at all. There is one quotation that captures the whole affair better than any other. It comes from Albert Speer, the man Hitler had placed in charge of armaments and of building the Atlantic Wall itself. Looking back on those defences, he said that to build those over 2 years, Germany had used 13 million cubic metres of concrete and 1.5 million tons of steel. And a fortnight after the landings, he said, that costly effort was brought to nothing by an idea of simple genius. That was the answer the German commanders could not work out as they watched the water fill with iron. The Allies had not found a secret way to capture a port. They had decided they did not need one. They had looked at the rule that every general in Europe treated as iron law, the rule that said an invasion lives or dies by its harbour, and they had quietly refused to obey it. The German generals could not explain how Britain invaded without a port, because they were still waiting for the enemy to play by a rule the enemy had already abandoned. They had built a wall to guard the doors. They never imagined an army that would arrive carrying its own.